Firewatch was one of the games of 2016 I was looking forward to the most. Today, I will, as briefly as possible, and I know that's something I'm not known for, explain why it lived up to and even passed my expectations when given time to reflect. Firewatch tells the story of Henry, a man trying to escape his past, spending time perhaps to find himself isolated in the wilderness, watching for fires in Shoshone National Forest, Wyoming. Now, since last night, I haven't been able to stop thinking about the story in this game. It captures your attention. Even after finishing the game, you continue to interpret choices you made in conversations that you had. As I said before, this release was one that I was looking forward to greatly, but I had no real idea about what the story would involve in this game. Now, as with many titles, I avoided deliberately reading news or seeing too many previews about it. Not easy for me, a YouTuber, when I'm supposed to be talking about upcoming games and aware of these things. But sometimes there's just, it's more important to preserve that expectation, that excitement of discovery for yourself. Firewatch, though, surprised me greatly. For one thing, it was far more adult than I expected, both in language and theme. For another, it was altogether more disturbing, and it set your mind racing several times just trying to figure out what on earth was going on here. The pacing of the narrative was spot on. I enjoy an unfolding, unrushed story. Some people would call that slow. I prefer to think of it as allowing a story to be told with space to think about the meanings and consequences of your actions. The vector art style of the game is one of the most significant elements of it for me. As an artist, I particularly appreciate the beautiful waves of colour that wash through the game, from burning heat in the day to warm night hues and then cool drops in the caves. The day-night transitions serve more than just as an aesthetic, but they are a mood changer. They carry you through the events and in part dictate the feelings that you have. Alone in the day, you'll always be different to alone at night. That's just a natural human instinct. The sound design and ambient music choices are another strong tool that pull you in and set the tone. This was commented on throughout my livestream, people exclaiming that the scoring of the game was exceptional, and as I regularly state, sound and background music are underestimated greatly and they fuel your emotions. Another important point about the game is the level of immersion, and this is key to how you play. If you're the kind of player who doesn't really invest feelings into a character, your experience would probably be more hollow and I would imagine far less satisfying. Firewatch from the beginning makes a big effort to immerse you in the character of Henry. When I first started the game, I was actually worried that it might be more like Kentucky Route Zero. Not to say that Kentucky Route Zero is a bad game, because I played through it and I love it, but it wasn't what I was expecting with Firewatch. The establishing story element of the game is actually more important than you would give it credit for initially. On reflection, you can see how this early section of the game carefully not only creates your character by having you choose responses, but by engaging you directly with his story, it pulls you into his world so that when the game begins in earnest, you're more deeply immersed in that world. Delilah is not a supporting character in the game, but neither is she the main character. Despite the fact you never set eyes on her, which I think is actually a shame, the relationship between Delilah and Henry is a real partnership. She helps you, she guides you, she supports you. It's perhaps one of the most engaging and actually fulfilling interactions I've had with an in-game character. Now, as I said, I do feel it's a shame that you never get to meet her. I feel this would have only actually strengthened your bond to her character, and there were several opportunities in the game where this could have happened. It surely must have been a deliberate decision by the developer to not include her, and I assume that this is so that, similarly when you read a novel, each person creates a vision of a character in their mind, and I think that there is actually a certain beauty in choosing this. Less truly is more, and we sadly live in an age where this kind of mystique is lost. Delilah, I wouldn't though say is the star of the game. Just from browsing around the internet this morning, I found a few people sort of saying like she's the main, she's the best, blah blah, and I kind of feel that that's the mainstream gaming media and that they will be very quick to jump onto her because this is fairly common now. Whenever a female character in a game has a reasonably strong role to play, she suddenly becomes this amazing, memorable character. Henry, by comparison, is a bit of a bumbling fool as Delilah leads him around. And on the other hand, your immersion with Henry and the believability of his story is precisely why you invest so strongly with Delilah. So as I said, their relationship is very much more symbiotic, and I don't feel that the character, one or the other, really outshines them. Let's talk about fear. So few games capture the true emotion of fear as well as I experienced in Firewatch. The feeling of isolation and having to watch your back was tangible. Now, as I say, so few games make you feel a genuine and unnerving sense of fear. Many horror games or simulators, fear simulators like Five Nights at Freddy's, Slenderman, they just rely on cheap jump scares. No better than a movie that you're going to, they're kind of equivalent things there, these kind of cheap horror films that are just like, bah, and they have no real substance. They boil down to someone just coming up behind you and going, boo. Now, other fear games like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, of course, do a better job of making you feel unnerved, but often the physical action that occurs in those games, the shooting or the battling, means that you can power through, and when you get into that action phase, you can largely ignore the fear that you should be feeling because you're running on adrenaline. The fear and unease you feel in Firewatch is not the same as either of these games' genres, but it is perhaps actually more powerful. Myst and Riven were both games where I genuinely found it was possible to feel yourself being fearful or unnerved at times, that sort of weird feeling that something's not quite right. Even though these games were ultimately safe and no harm could largely come to you, this is very similar to Firewatch. It's more akin to them in this way. No real danger exists for you in Firewatch, but that cultivation of fear is very strong. It actually, a bit of an analogy, it reminded me of an old black and white film I watched with my parents years ago. I forgot the title of it now, but I remember we read the description of what that film was, and we were thinking, of an evening, this won't be too bad. It's an old movie. It only had a 12 rating. My God, we all went to bed with the lights on that night. It was so unnerving, and not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't show and its use of sound, and Firewatch is a perfect example of this. What you feel in Firewatch is not a literal fear of circumstances, but more your own imagination running away with you, perpetuating your feelings of the unknown. What is it that's after you? A bear? A psychopathic murderer? Government agents who want to capture and experiment on you? This sense of unknowing has you questioning everything and searching for scraps of clues in every ranger box that are scattered throughout the game. You find, when you read through them, you're scanning for any detail, anything that might give you a hint on to help your situation. This again demonstrates the smart design, the way in which the game involves you with its elements. Now, a perfect contrasting example of this would be Rise of the Tomb Raider, which I've also been playing this week. Now, throughout your journey in Tomb Raider, and I'll just say I'm interested in history, as I highlighted in my live streams. Now, you find these archives, these scraps of historical story, but it has no real connection to you. And as much as I read through it and I kind of listen to it, there's no real reason to listen to or analyze the information, so you really find yourself not caring about it. After the first few, it's like, oh yeah, this guy had some horses and he found a thing with the tribe and they died or whatever. It doesn't really engage you. There's no reason for you to engage with it, and because it's so fragmented, you can't really truly engage with it because you have 15-minute gaps where you then find another 2 paragraphs. It just doesn't really engage you. Not so in Firewatch. I read every little piece of info, even small details on maps. I was scrambling for anything that might shed some light on what was happening to me, and that is a very, very clever mechanic. Often when we're talking about FPS, we're talking about mechanics in-game which actually direct the player to a certain course of action, and that it's better to do that than expect people to make those jumps for themselves. A couple of small negatives for me lie in the scripted nature of the game. I will say that I absolutely appreciate that this game is from a smaller studio and there are very real limitations therefore on what is possible. I also will say that despite the game being heavily scripted and linear, it does an amazing job in making you feel like that's actually not the case at all. The way your story is interwoven with Delilah and the excellent work of the voice actors makes it very believable and very natural. However, you are restricted in talking to Delilah, and generally you can only initiate contact with her on a point of interest. This means you sometimes feel forcibly isolated, and it's one of my main gripes. The other was that something I experienced when entering the cave system. Now, I moved into this cave system, I heard the gate shut behind me. This didn't really surprise me because as a gamer, doors have a habit of closing themselves behind you, so I didn't really think anything of this. But on exiting the cave, Henry radioed through to Delilah to tell her someone had shut the door behind and run off. I felt a bit cheated because I'd missed out on that opportunity. This was the only time this happened to me actually throughout the game. Believability in games that heavily immerse you is always important. There are a few times I struggled with this. For example, finding a chain link fence that I would argue most people could easily just hop over, especially when I found a nearby rock that was half the height of the fence, made it seem a little bit silly as an impassable barrier. It wouldn't have been too hard to just add some razor wire to the top of the fence, and that would have made it far more believable as to why you wanted to just unlock the gate rather than, risking slashing yourself up. Another one was at one point I radioed to Delilah to explain I couldn't climb back up because I just dropped off this heavy drop point. But just on walking to the side of this, I found there was an invisible wall that prevented me from dropping down on the other side of this thing far less than the big drop that I had just taken, about half the height, just a couple of feet. Anybody could have made that little drop. It was a little bit silly. These are not huge gripes, but they do just break that immersion for you in the game, and I always feel like these are things that could have been solved very easily with just a little piece of graphical scenery, and of which we have no shortage of that. There's trees and bushes and things all over the place. As I say though, these are really minor gripes, but they did just break that believability of my situation, and they just took me out of the game a little, and that's a shame. So let's talk about the biggest elephant in the room, Delilah and that call. Early in the game, you overhear Delilah speaking to someone on the radio. You hear her exclaiming that he has no idea. She's sure of this. You are, of course, expecting to infer that as yourself. When questioning her about this, she becomes defensive and goes off comms for a while. Now, many people, including myself, took this conversation to spark paranoia and conspiracy theories that Delilah has some ulterior motive, that she is up to no good. This is only exacerbated by the discovery of the government research station and the mysterious transcripts of your conversations. These suspicious events keep you questioning. Does Delilah know what's really happening here? Is she playing you like a sap and you are just her pawn in some game? Even right to the very end, when she states that she's going to be leaving without you, you're questioning, will she leave me here to die? Now, on ascending Delilah's watchtower eventually, I was certain that I would find clues and details that revealed the truth to me about what had been going on, the final twist in the tale. But this was not the case. It turned out that no, actually there was no big conspiracy, it really was just the ex-watchtower guy whose son, it appears, accidentally died. He was behind it all. It was certainly at first a bit of an anti-climax. I was fully prepared to be left dying in a burning watchtower as the flames reach higher and higher and I fall into a white-hot oblivion of burning timber. The conclusion was far more domestic. We had a small little chat with Delilah, who declined our invitation to come with me to Boulder. I wonder if this result can be different dependent on the choices you make on subsequent playthroughs. I hope so, and I'll try to find that out soon. Still though, Firewatch had a huge potential for a terrifying murder or a deeper conspiracy narrative. Instead, it plays out as all the paranoia being largely in your head. Now, I've seen many people initially exclaim that this is somewhat disappointing, especially after the game was very careful to lay the seeds of paranoia early on in the game when you overhear Delilah's conversation. Now, I think it's a valid point of view that we expected a different ending, that it could have been darker throughout. In fact, there are many endings that you could speculate for the game. Delilah could have been murdered, she could have been in on it, she could have left you to die to protect herself, agents could kidnap her and you have to rescue her, or they kidnap you, something like this. How long is a piece of string? But let me offer you an alternative perspective that is perhaps less obvious. That initial disappointment of the resolution being actually fairly simple left me thinking and considering the sequence of events. It made me realise that what this game is showing you is the power of the mind, and this is the true lesson and the brilliance of the game that I took away, that you can do far more with seeds of an idea than those events actually taking place. I could give many examples of this in modern media. I think we are all too aware that things are often revealed too early or shown in their digital glory, be that horror or action, when it would have been far more powerful to leave the viewer to imagine the consequences. This is where the power of reading lies, the imagination of the reader. This is why so many people often will read a book and say that the film did not live up to their expectations, because their imagination is far greater than what the movie delivered, or maybe it just didn't align with how they imagined that sequence of events. Firewatch is very much a digital interactive novel. You create much of the narrative yourself and you are left to create the figure of Delilah. the imaginary suspicious figures who are after you, the disappearance of the girls, it's all in your head. Now you could argue certainly that I'm just rationalising an ending that was unsatisfactory. I can appreciate that. But I really feel that what the game was showing us is not just the story as it unfolds, but a deeper meaning that we should remember that the best stories are told by laying the foundations and then allowing the reader or viewer to create their own interpretations. Something that is so commonly lacking in an age where media is literally spoon-fed to its audience, and often patronisingly so. Even this, though, is not what makes Firewatch truly brilliant. What makes Firewatch an absolute masterpiece of a game for me is its accessibility. This is something incredibly difficult to do and few games manage to achieve. To create a game that is simple enough in its mechanics to be playable by gamer and non-gamer alike. To have a story, characters and visual style that would engage anyone, and to fit all of that into a few hours gameplay is a masterstroke. Let's just mention the playtime while we're at it as well. I can imagine some people might have wanted the game to be a little longer. As a bit of a harder gamer, I agree. I would have aimed for something like 5 hours, not 3. Still though, games come out so quickly of late, I actually appreciate a game that I can burn through and still be completely satisfied at the end of it. I very often find myself at a loss to be able to think of a game that was absolutely engaging and captivating for me as a hardcore gamer with 20 years playing behind me, yet also a game that I can use to get non-gamers to play and not become frustrated with or put down in the first 10 minutes. And just allow them to see the true joy and beauty that gaming offers and why it's not something that's just for kids, as I am often reminded by people who have no real understanding of gaming. I loved Firewatch. It fulfilled my expectations and upon post-dissecting the game revealed itself to be even more brilliant than I first thought. I would recommend this game to anyone, and Campo Santo are definitely a studio to watch for their next title in the future. So that's my thoughts on Firewatch. If you enjoyed my video, please drop a like, always helps me out so much, and leave your comments below, your thoughts on the game, how it played out, was it engaging, was it fantastic, was it a disappointment? Tell me down below.